It's the Sam Aronow 100th episode spectacular with special guests Suzanne Summers, Harvey Korman, and the Harlem Globetrotters. I'm Sam Aronow. I couldn't decide on a funny musical guest, and this is the recap video for my coverage of 1920s Czechoslovakia, the United States, and Germany, in which I talk about things I left out of the videos, correct mistakes that I made in the videos, and answer questions from Gaon and Navi level patrons on Patreon. Before diving in, I'd like to do some housekeeping. First, sorry for the delays in getting the videos out recently. Without getting into the particulars, a lot of things have been happening over the last 7 months, mostly bad things, and they've impacted my ability to complete videos on the schedule I'd prefer. But since June, I'm in the process of getting actual paid sponsorships, and I'm eager to get back to my normal schedule. So I've made a painful but practical decision to postpone my next country special, despite having filmed quite a lot of it on location all the way back in January, just so I can get a little bit of a head start. Second, this is the end of my 1920s coverage, mostly. For those of you disappointed by my lack of coverage of certain other countries, many of them I hope to visit in full in the 1930s because I thought it more thematically appropriate to wait until then. But plans change and life happens, so that's as much as I'm willing to say about it right now. So let's get into it. First up, a correction. The Masaryk Forest is in the Jezreel Valley, not the Judean Mountains. I actually caught this before uploading, as it's shown correctly on the map and in the subtitles in all 3 languages. But it was after I recorded, and I wasn't in a position to go back to my mom's house to record a patch for the narration, which is something I actually do quite a lot. For acoustic reasons, I prefer to record there versus my own apartment. I should have caught this earlier just by looking it up online, but the secondary source that I use as the entry point for most of my research also got it wrong, so it didn't occur to me to double check. Live and learn. Another correction. Congress passed the 18th Amendment for ratification during the war. It was only ratified after. And a lot of the impetus for Prohibition then wasn't only military, but because many of the most prominent opponents of Prohibition were German-American brewers, who weren't in a position to be listened to at the time. This isn't a new observation, but I find it interesting that there was so much more knee-jerk anti-Germanism during the First World War than during the Second. Maybe we just gotten it out of our systems. In discussing this period, I was also expecting certain questions that I was surprised nobody asked about my omission of the 19th Amendment. At the time I was making the US video, Jenny Draper released a video of her own about the women's suffrage movement in Britain, which made me want to comment on women's suffrage in the United States, and particularly the question of why the passage of the 19th Amendment isn't nearly as sentimentalized in the United States as the Representation of the People Act 1918 in the United Kingdom. One reason that she correctly identifies is that racially discriminatory laws in the South ensured that black women in much of the country still wouldn't be able to exercise their voting rights. But while that's definitely important, I think there's an even bigger reason. So I emailed her about it, and with her permission, I'd like to share some of that email with you. Our muted centenary may result from the fact that most women in the US already had voting rights before the 19th Amendment. As of ratification, 18 states already had complete women's suffrage, and an additional 22 had given women the right to vote for some, but not all, political offices. Most of the states that didn't have any voting rights for women had racially discriminatory voting laws, so the only places where passage was truly as impactful as in the UK were Pennsylvania, Maryland, and West Virginia. There was also some stuff in there relating to bad faith arguments she got from Americans linking voter registration to military conscription, which isn't true and has never been true. And they seem to have briefly convinced her that we actively have mandatory military service in the US, which we haven't since 1973. We just have to register for it, but even 9/11 didn't trigger it. I think it's pretty interesting, and it annoys me to hear continued misinformation about conscription in the US that ties into our country's stab in the back myth regarding the Vietnam War. But if we go through that now, we'll be here all day. I'm already like 5 digressions deep. On our subreddit, which I should note I didn't create, I received a comment about Germany's reparations which featured some interesting points. But a few days later, someone retorted that the poster was French and misinterpreted the true scale of Germany's reparations, so I'm gonna offer a synthesis that I hope will better characterize the reparations in the context of the time. First of all, while Germany's reparations for the First World War were unprecedentedly large, sizable reparations for defeated powers in a war were nothing new, and France was pretty eager to get payback for the reparations they had to pay in the Franco-Prussian War, which it's worth remembering was only 50 years earlier. Second, the 123 billion mark figure was for all the defeated Central Powers, not just Germany, although virtually all of it was just Germany. However, most of the nominal amount was allocated to so-called C bonds, which were interest-free and had no deadline, so they were really just a bargaining tool to placate France that Germany was never really expected to pay. And that's to say nothing about the Lausanne Conference, where the Papen Hitler government rejected an international proposal to reduce Germany's outstanding reparations by 90% in response to the Great Depression. Another correction, albeit a minor one in its historical context, Max Nivelli was much more prolific as a producer than as a director. I say this with the caveat that this is a bigger distinction today than it would have been in the 1920s, when it was, I don't want to say common, but not unheard of for producers to fulfill some of the roles we would expect of a director today. Only in the 1950s was the idea of the director as the primary author of a film solidified. Gaon-level patron Cheese 101 asks, you mentioned early in the Weimar video that the Center Party had attracted modern Orthodox voters. So what the hell changed by the time Franz von Papen welcomed Hitler into the government? Was this a top-down decision, or had the party generally been indifferent to Nazis? This is an easy question. While the Center Party did make something of a rightward shift between 1929 and 1933, Papen, who spent most of his career in the Center Party, was a complete rogue. The reason he became chancellor as an independent was because he quit the party before the party could expel him, and they spent most of the remaining political capital opposing him. That said, the center did eventually cave to the Nazis and voted for the Enabling Act out of fear that he would retaliate against the Catholic Church if they didn't, but that's a topic for another time. Navi-level patron David Ben Yosef asks, you mentioned in Jews under Weimar that race and anti-Semitism were at the center of Nazi ideology, but that most Nazi political speeches didn't center it in their rhetoric. Was this true through and through, or in this period only? For this episode, I didn't go into a lot of detail about Nazi activity, and that was by design. The title of the episode is Jews under Weimar, so my intention was to present events as a common citizen would have understood them, and my vagueness about Nazi ideology and their personalities was deliberate. The reason is, I'm going to go into that much more in the next video, which will basically be all about that. So if you allow me to lazily copy-paste part of my upcoming script, such as it is, during their years of obscurity, the Nazis had created special interest clubs for every possible demographic. Goebbels bragged that Nazi propaganda could be endlessly reshaped to expand the party's appeal, and if he had to lie to the German people to get their attention, that's what he would do. Even the party's hatred of Jews was carefully moderated. They could never hide it. The SA participated in anti-Jewish riots in Berlin and routinely harassed businesses and local governments into suppressing the work of Jewish artists, but for many prospective voters, this was a turnoff. So Nazi speakers responded by minimizing anti-Semitic rhetoric around certain audiences. It might seem strange that that would work, but anti-Semitism had been such a regular feature on the German right that people could easily write it off as bluster. But eventually, after the seizure of power, the anti-Semitic rhetoric did become more and more bold. It was sort of a way of easing the public into complete radicalization. And that's the 1920s. As I said, I'm skipping the next special for now, so as the last video of the 1920s was about Germany, so the first video of the 1930s will also be about Germany. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, David Ben Yosef, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, Dr. Chike, Andrew Ettinger, FC, Jay Fleischman, Osher Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Sol Cohn, Jacob Kossoff, Milk and Honey, David Safarian, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.